with basic skills being still overseas, we want to literally leverage all of our high technology and experience in education here to the more high-end, if I'm saying this correctly, the more high-end tasks and high-end jobs. So, game development, the reason why that's a huge focus for us here at Northeastern is it's an area that's really hard to hire out in the workforce. It's very hard to find any programs internationally that properly train for what we call game design, meaning a marriage of creative and technology, computer science, art and design together, specifically for game design. So to me, it's all fascinating, working all around the world. I've started up animation studios in Mumbai. I've started them in Toronto and LA. And everyone's doing the same thing. They're using the same hardware, the same software, the same tools, the same techniques. And we just need to leverage currently, which is the only thing that's lacking overseas in all of these initiatives, which is senior creative and technology leadership.
I think that's really interesting, because when we've looked at the top companies in games and film and video, it's around about 80, I think it's something like 80% of the top companies are foreign owned in London. It is simply owned by Japanese or yourselves, for the film, but it doesn't matter,
right?
Because they're operational in London, and they're subcontracting their work within the system. But ownership, interestingly, in that sense, in the London setup of film, is pretty much entirely foreign owned. In games, it's not far off, and there's been great consolidation, as you probably know, in the large businesses in games. So there are fewer companies that own the smaller companies. And what's happened is that the smaller companies have retained, the large companies have retained the names of the smaller companies, but actually own them. So there's actually very few large companies that have got great control of the games industry in the UK, for example, and most of those are from the US and Japan.
What's been interesting to us recently is a lot of them have kind of rediscovered that Massachusetts is where there's an incredible amount of really brilliant people because of all the university talent here. And so you see folks like Microsoft and Google feeling they have to open shops here simply because half the people they're hiring are from here, and not everybody wants to move out to California. And so, the same goes true for a lot of our entertainment companies and our local entertainment companies. Almost every single one of them has an LA shop or might be owned by someone who's based in LA, but felt like they also really wanted to be here for some reason or another because of the intellectual talent that we have here. So it's really our greatest asset. And what we're trying to do is, we don't care who it's like, we'll take the jobs. Like we would love to nurture Massachusetts homegrown companies, of course, first and foremost. But if Google's going to bring 300 jobs to the state, we're not going to protest that. That's actually not really an issue to us, at least in this field, because a lot of these industries are so multi-headed and are so all over the place, anyways. So.
In video game production, for instance, what happens typically is there'll be a leader of a team within a very large publisher, say an EA or a THQ or Ubisoft, and they'll create a franchise that's very successful, and the team itself is very insular and very successful. That team will break off and basically quit, start their own startup, do their own entrepreneurial thing, and they'll have enough of a cachet and a reputation to do so, startup funds and such. That's done a lot in Massachusetts. But then what happens is this developer, and that's the relationship. You have the publishers like the EAs, Nintendos, and Sony, basically THQ, and then you get the small developers that spin off and just actually create the content, actually make the actual video games themselves. They have to retain those publishing relationships, just like movies need distributors. But what happens is when the developers become very successful, then the 5-year business plan, the out for a lot of these business plans is to actually get bought by a publisher. So so these
That's
these
like their
companies,
dream.
yeah, exactly. You know, the dream is to have a game start up and get bought by a publisher. So this just it's like a meat grinder. You know, it just kind of cyclically brings all this talent all the way through. And
I think it depends on the industry. I mean, for video gaming,
This is
it's
video
a
games
very
specifically.
typical kind of IT structure, right? You know, that what you just said was very typical for all of IT in general. Film is very different. You know, film is definitely its own bird, and if you're an independent entrepreneurial film producer, it's you know, your dream may be to sell it to a studio and make lots of money from it someday. Or your dream that's you know, that your dream may just be to keep doing documentaries because that's your art form, right? You know, for design is a more service-based industry, so there's an incredible amount of entrepreneurs in that. Networking is incredibly important in that role, and you know, and for, you know, advertising is sort of similar design into that respect. You know, your dream isn't someday as a designer to be bought up by a large architecture firm. You know, so it is different by industry, and I think the big underlying theme for all of that is that talented entrepreneurs are really the thing that the world is in competition for right now. I mean, not to like go back to Thomas Friedman, the world is flat and all that jazz, but I mean, the reason we're focusing on the creative industries in the state is because we see these as the innovators, right? That kid who created Facebook left Massachusetts and felt like he had to go to California. You know, not necessarily creative industry, but you know, what's the next Avid? How do we keep that here? You know, yeah, exactly. What's the next big video game company? What's the next rock band creator? How do we make them realize that this is? How do you create an environment where those kind of talented entrepreneurs want to feel like they can stay and do their business? And so that's, to me, what a lot of this creative industries work is really about, is that these are the really cutting edge, most talented people, and we want them. You know, everybody wants them right now. That's really what the world is in competition for. I mean, would you agree with that? I don't know if that's too broad based.
I think in part, I've got sort of two answers to it. I think really one you've already touched on, which is I think actually, in one sense, the large companies gobble anything new up, and then turn it into what they wanted to turn into. So I think we've covered that ground. Well, what I think there's actually something called a cultural entrepreneur, and I want to give you an example of this, in the sense that Sheffield Creative Industries Quarter, that was established around about 20 years ago, was started by one man, just one man, and that man was into a particular kind of popular music at the time. So he was interested in his music of his generation, and he realized in Sheffield that there was nowhere where the bands could play and people could listen to that music in that city. So what did he do? He took the risk and he hired an old mill near the railway station for a weekend. He broke all the rules, absolutely every single one. Health and safety, what's that? Etc. And he rented it for the weekend. And it was a raging success. You know, everybody turned up, the bands loved it, he made some money. So the next time round, he rented it again, did it again, did it again, did it again. And he started making quite a lot of money. He liked it. And then he realized that if he invested the money in some recording studios, he could then record and produce the CDs, etc., of these bands. That's what he did. He made some real rough recordings, some rough studios, etc., very cheap, all the rest of it. The council were nowhere in sight. The agencies were nowhere in sight. And I want to use that as an example. So he then, because of that, the kind of subgroupings, the subcultures coalesced around it. And it started to take on a life of its own. So therefore, there was studios, there was performances, and all the rest of the things that began to happen as a result of that. And other creatives began to coalesce around what was an exciting part of town, right? Then the dead hand of the council got hold of it.
Exactly.
And guess where the cultural entrepreneur went? Somewhere else. He left. There's a story there.